Hello once again, Cougar Nation. Welcome to another edition of Voiceover with Greg and Shep. I am Greg Wrubell. He is Jason Shepherd. And we are joined today by Andy Katz. Andy, as you all know, is a multimedia host, writer, and reporter for NCAA.com and the NCAA's multiple college basketball platforms. He's a college basketball analyst for multiple networks and leagues, including the West Coast Conference. So we see him time and again in these parts. And he was, of course, a senior college basketball writer for ESPN from 2000 through 2017. Prior to that, he was a writer for college basketball with the Fresno Bee, the Albuquerque Journal, and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Andy, thanks for taking a little bit of time with us today.
Wow, you didn't leave anything out from the resume. I would say one of the things I miss about living in the East that I loved living in the West was my time going to Utah. And I'm hoping I can come back more often. But I've got, as you guys know, I mean, from the 90s, I got great memories of the Marriott Center, those great Utah-BYU rivalries, covering when New Mexico was really good, going into Provo. Same with Fresno when they were going to BYU. And so when we had that game this season, which I wish I could have been at, between BYU and Gonzaga, and everyone's talking about how great the Marriott Center was.
Right.
I remember how great that place was, and when it's packed with 20,000 strong and one of the best home courts in the country. And it was great to see that environment again. I know it's been like that at times before, but still, that's what I remember the most from the 90s.
You mentioned the Gonzaga game, and that was when we were still all in the throes of March Madness or impending March Madness. And of course, you were part of the scenario in Las Vegas, and we're almost 2 months out now from the COVID-19 cancellations and everything that's followed. If you had to kind of encapsulate your reflections of these last 2 months, how do you do it?
So first of all, guys, I mean, it's something we've never experienced in any of our lifetimes. And it just the way it came to a screeching halt, I still find myself, and I actually had a conversation on Wednesday night with Gloria Nevarez, the WCC commissioner, just coincidentally talked to her on Wednesday night, and we hadn't talked since sitting at the Orleans that night, Tuesday night, after the championship games between the men that night with Gonzaga and St. Mary's, and earlier in the day with the women with Portland and San Diego. And I was just thinking about how crazy it was, even though at that moment we knew things were getting a little, hectic, and but they got their tournament in, wasn't sure what was going to happen. Obviously, 24 hours later, I ended up going to the Big Ten tournament, and all that had happened where that gets shut down 36 hours later. Still, it's just surreal to think how we were in Vegas, great event, the Jordan Ford shot, that night before against BYU from St. Mary's, and just all this excitement, and then the screeching halt. And clearly, obviously, the last 5-6 weeks has been like nothing I've ever experienced, and any of us have in the world, in the country. Though only people old enough to remember the Spanish flu, but so just trying to get through it. I'm very optimistic and hopeful that we're going to still have our normal season beginning next season. Unequivocally, I still believe that we will have an NCAA tournament next year and a college football playoff. When it happens, I don't know, but I know that all the powers that be are making sure that it will happen. Things just may get shifted in the schedule. That's the worst case scenario if things were to get to move. And one thing, if I could just jump ahead for 1 second, I will say this to all your viewers, that what I've been told is the worst case scenario is we would push the NCAA tournament and everything in front of that a month. That would be the worst case scenario if we don't start on time. Remember, the Final Four is in Indianapolis next season. You get the Indy 500, which usually takes up 2 weekends. So you really would have to be done by probably May 8th, somewhere around then. But that's the big debate, the contingency plans. How much of the season do we get in if we don't start on time? You got to have some non-conference games. All these things are floating around. Hopefully it doesn't have to happen. But I firmly believe we will have a season of some form and a tournament.
Well, that's certainly good news, and obviously something that the college basketball fans are very excited to hear. One of the interesting things about this whole situation, Andy, is even though we've all been dealing with it for a couple of months, we're all still being educated on exactly what it all entails. And you've been hosting the NCAA Social Series on COVID-19 related issues. How much has that helped you personally in terms of your own education on this whole situation?
Tremendously. I've loved doing it. We've had various doctors from Emory, from Johns Hopkins, psychiatrists from Wisconsin because of the mental health aspect, student athletes, Dr. Brian Hainline, who's the chief medical officer we've had on every week. I've got a self-interest here because my daughter is going to Northwestern in the fall. And so, I want her to start on time. I know her first quarter is not going to be normal, but I want her to be on campus, experience that with her peers. It's something she'll never forget. But I'm hopeful that they'll be able to be on campus in some form. And look, all our lives are connected to college athletics, those of us here on this Zoom call. So we need it to happen. We want it to happen safely. But, we've got to get the thing that there's obviously a lot of thresholds here. We got to get students on campus first. College athletics is much different than the pros. I'm still skeptical that these bubbles can exist for NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball. But for college athletics, there has to be student athletes. There has to be students on campus to have student athletes. We're not going to see just football players or just, soccer or what have you. So we've got to get students on first. And then if you can have, forms of social distancing on campus, which I think you can, spread out students if you need to in the dorms, staggered dining halls, big lecture halls maybe are online, smaller group classes certainly can be, together. This big, I'm not a doctor, but this is what they're telling me that I believe in that sense, it all can be accomplished. So how do you get from that point to actually competing and practicing? Because you can't have social distancing on the football field and, on the soccer pitch and all that. So the transition to that has to be testing and tracing, which I'm convinced, based on what I'm hearing, is we're going to see universities in mass purchasing their own testing and doing that to their students, to their student athletes for a comfort level, and their faculty and their coaching and all the peripheral people, and having a plan in place. What happens if someone tests positive? How many people does that have to sit down for X amount of time? I'm hoping, obviously, and everyone else is, that by that point, we'll have more ways to treat it. Maybe not a vaccine, obviously, but some ways to treat it so that it would mitigate even the quarantine time. And certainly the population that we're talking about, athletes, being in great shape, that could certainly help mitigate, any, symptoms that you would have. So, there's a lot of positive developments happening. I think it'll change dramatically between, the beginning of May as we're approaching to even the summer. And that's why I'm hoping that no decisions are going to be made in the early spring. I think you could go until July before you make any final decisions about fall sports. Probably around July 1st is when universities are going to have to make their decisions about whether or not students are on campus. But fall sports, I think you could wait till that point as well and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, it's right there. So it's testing, it's tracing, it's treatment, and then the other T would be timetables. And you've heard from enough medical experts at this point to have a sense of what may or may not be possible relative to the sports that start in the summer. Is your sense that an August rollout is still possible for the sports that have to get going around that time?
I'm a little skeptical about August. I think this is just based on all my conversations. I think the best case scenario is a delayed start because the Football Oversight Committee is pretty adamant about wanting 4 to 6 weeks. And so let's assume that, they're going to say, okay, you can be on campus by mid-August or even late August. Then that still pushes, your at least football into early October. Other sports, they're going to have to be faced with a little bit of a dilemma in that football, because of the health and safety aspect, and there's a lot of talk about the musculoskeletal injuries that they do not want to suddenly have happen. And obviously there's concussion protocol, all these kinds of things with football that's on another level. But a sport like soccer, for example, or field hockey, that take place in the fall, they may have to say, okay, what is a legitimate amount of time that we need, that minimum amount of time to get ready for a season? Obviously, I know you would want at least a month to train and get in shape and all that, but they may be pressed to say, okay, to get our season in, what's our minimum? And those sports may be faced with that dilemma. if they want to play then. Because what these universities don't want to have happen, but it could, is if everything gets pushed to the spring semester. Because if that happens, you've got facility issues on all these campuses. You know, obviously the best ones in terms of the richest, if you will, in terms of facility rich, you know, may have a separate field for every sport, but that's not the case in most schools, where a field hockey team may share with a lacrosse field, and the same with soccer and lacrosse. And so you'd have a lot of issues there. Volleyball, big sport, you know, at BYU, very popular sport, both men and women, highly successful championship level. Okay, if you push that to the spring, you've got facility issues potentially with men's and women's basketball. If you also have wrestling, what do you do with that? You know, a lot of that is shared facilities. And so you throw all these sports together, and that's going to be a problem. You know, some obviously might have a volleyball designated area, but not all do. And so there's a myriad of problems that could develop. Yeah. And the last thing that on this whole thing, and there are more, but I don't want to, you know, jump ahead of your topics, but the other problem that could happen that really relates to BYU as well is we are going to see different states come online, if you will. I don't mean online for school, but online to be ready to go at different times. And that really could happen out west as it relates to the WCC and the Pac-12. You know, all indications are you guys are there in Utah, that Utah will be better off than some other states, certainly maybe California. So what happens if BYU and Utah and Arizona State and Washington State and Gonzaga in that part of Washington are all ready to go? Our students are on campus because their universities can make that decision in accordance, you know, with their state government. But let's say California's not, or Seattle's not where Washington is. So what do? You know, how do you run your conference if that happens? I think it's a big problem in the fall. In the spring, I think what could happen is if some schools still are not on campus, and there may be some that choose to go online the whole year, then you're going to have to leave them behind. And that is what I've heard, that it's not the NCAA's thinking, but it will have to be for this season. You don't want to go there, but there are going to be dates that if we're ready to start our sport on this date and the majority are ready, then we're going. And if UCLA soccer, which is a, you know, big time program, isn't ready to go, and maybe they're not ready to go until December or January, and they miss out, then they miss out. You know, those are things that are going to have to be discussed, and I think they need to be discussed here in the mid to late spring, certainly before we get to the fall.
All right, Andy, let's focus on you a little bit. As Greg mentioned when we brought you on, you've had a lot of varying experiences in a lot of different places throughout your career, but you started out in the print media. So let's go back in the Wayback Machine as a student at Wisconsin. Take us through getting that first job in Milwaukee and really how your career started.
I was very fortunate. You know, I talked to a lot of journalism students today, and my path just doesn't exist right now. And yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities. Like, you know, for example, what you guys do is phenomenal. Like, I love BYUtv. I think your sports end is great, and there are opportunities like that. And other universities are trying, and other networks. That's like sort of a new path. You know, for me, in the 90s, it was newspapers. And so I was a student at Wisconsin. I was very fortunate because my senior year, there'd always been someone had gone from the student newspaper to maybe the local paper in Madison to the Milwaukee Journal as sort of a stepping stone. We'd had great success of our sports editors doing that. And I was next in line, and I got that gig where you were the backup. That was sort of a cheap way for Milwaukee to do this, but they used the student backup to their their full-time beat writer for basketball and football that was stationed in Madison. And so I would do the backup work for the pro, if you will, and, you know, was getting bylines. And then I just coincidentally, they say, hey, you know, the hockey team's really good. So they gave me the hockey team as my own beat, and they ended up winning the national championship. And they had never done this, where they sent the student reporter, because I was still technically in school, to cover the team in the tournament, flew to Detroit. They won the national championship. They had a ton of NHL players on. And it was interesting because I was actually promised, this is how your career can go in different directions. At the time, there was all this talk that the Milwaukee Admirals, which is still a minor league team to this day, was going to be an NHL franchise. And I was told, hey, if this happens and there was a vote, you'll be the beat writer. And so I would have stayed in Milwaukee and would have maybe been an NHL guy. And because I'd sort of fallen into it, even though my passion was basketball. And, I covered the Big Ten Wisconsin basketball team, obviously, during my time as a student. But I was like, okay, this could be a great first job, covered an NHL team, beat writer. But at the time, the Chicago Blackhawks had a really cheap ownership group, and they used their whole, the geography to block it, to not have a team that was so close in proximity to Chicago. And so they blocked the expansion of Milwaukee into the NHL because it was right around the time the Bradley Center, had just come on. And so they had this new facility where the Bucks were playing, but it never happened. And so then I didn't know what I was going to do. And this job came open in New Mexico. Think about it. You've got a Northeast kid who went to school in Wisconsin. My mother's family's from Chicago. So that was my world, New England and the Midwest. And so I'd never been to, that part of the country, the Southwest. Went for an interview and ultimately got the job. And, that clearly just shaped my life. Ultimately met my wife in Albuquerque. Her family still lives there. And so we still go out west, obviously. But it's funny how all these things work out. But, I loved the WAC in the 90s was awesome.
Yeah.
You think about all the different coaches we had, teams that we were covering, and the different variations of the WAC at the time. But, a story that you may or may not know is that in 95, before I went to Fresno, I actually was a finalist and thought I was getting the job at the Deseret News. And this is a true story. It was over July 4th weekend. I interviewed for the job, and it was to cover BYU and the WAC because obviously they knew me from covering it in New Mexico. And I thought it was done. We went at the time, what we did was, we went to the bookstore and got the Salt Lake Tribune. My wife and I, we had just been married, and we were looking at apartments in Salt Lake. I loved going skiing there. I loved the Wasatch, everything about it, Provo, all that. Ready to do it. We were definitely going to take the job and do it. And then I get a call on that Monday after July 4th, that weekend, that they decided to promote from within. And then must have been maybe a month later that, because Tark had just gotten to Fresno, that then I got the call on Fresno. And then ultimately I went to Fresno. Coincidentally, me and actually Adrian Wojnarowski came at the same time, and both of us went there. But just so crazy how life could have been different, because I would have taken the BYU job because I wanted something different. We wanted something different. We just got married. We said, hey, you know what? She is from the West. And hey, let's move to Utah. So it's just crazy how all these things could have happened.
So from Albuquerque to Fresno B for you. And I think you were in Fresno at a time when Steve Cleveland,
yes,
who was the Fresno City College JUCO coach, ended up coming to BYU, right?
Yes, that's all true. Knew Steve very well because Fresno City was a big deal at the time in Fresno.
Yeah.
Fresno State and Fresno City. So Fresno City was great in the junior college. This was an era when junior college basketball out west and in California was a really big deal. Rafer Alston played for him. Skip to Malou, big New York City playground legend who ultimately goes to Fresno City and then Fresno State and then the NBA. And so, so I knew Steve well, and then, covered him when he went to BYU with Keith Schroyer, who was another California JUCO coach. Ultimately went to Wyoming, and now I'm drawing a blank where Heath is now. Had another stint, I think, at BYU, then went, for another head coaching gig.
He's at McNeese State now as a head coach.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there was all those ties, as well.
So you've touched on a couple of times covering BYU in the early 90s. Was that the first time that you certainly on that level, was that the first time that you really became acquainted with BYU athletics? Take us back to that time and your early impressions of BYU.
Well, let me first go back that I was, a college and sports fan growing up in the 80s. So I grew up in the 80s. And so I remember, I watched, all those great BYU football teams. Also, keep in mind, I grew up in Boston. And so I knew all about Danny Ainge. And ultimately, and it's great. I've become friends with him, obviously, through the Celtics. And he's great. Love Danny every time I see him and talk to him. So I at least had that connection and knew about, BYU and watched BYU. And also, my earliest memory, I may be dating myself, but my earliest memory of ever watching a Final Four was Magic Bird, which of course was at the Huntsman Center in Salt Lake. So there's those ties. But my impressions were always just wonderful about it. It always was my favorite trip. The thing about those trips we had in the WAC in those days, never a fan of El Paso, not to offend anyone on this, but, the Wyoming Colorado State trip was always weather related. Shockingly, there was one year where the WAC tournament was in Laramie, and we were in Laramie for almost a week. So, that was, and Sandy, I would say this, my favorite trip then, when we used to be able to go everywhere in newspapers, was the San Diego, Hawaii swing. I went to Hawaii 14 times when I was working in Albuquerque and Fresno. And so I love that swing. And then the Utah swing was great after that, because even though I grew up in New England, my family weren't skiers, so I never really went skiing. So I actually learned how to ski in Utah. We go a little bit in New Mexico, but I'd always go in Utah. And this was also an era where those games were a lot of times the games I covered were at 9 or 10 o'clock at night on those big Mondays or whatever the schedule was at Utah or BYU. And, now we're always working during the day, vlogs, videos, everything we're doing. Then I was a newspaper guy. I didn't have to do anything until the game. And so I would literally go skiing every day game, or every game day, I should say. And I went to Alta, Solitude, Park City, Sundance, all those places. And so, I loved it. And then, of course, I cannot go without saying that, I ended up having a wonderful friendship with Rick. And, he really helped my career because he introduced me to a lot of different people. And I cannot tell you how many times, I would just talk with Majerus, late at night, talking basketball, life, all these kinds of things. And there were so many times we'd have these late night meals, in Salt Lake at his usual spots. It's interesting. I was not close with Roger. He was kind of hard to get close to, but, and I would say since then, I've been actually, I feel like really close with all the BYU coaches. But those Majerus Reed rivalries were great, and just were great, I think, for the sport, for the state, for the city, and the whole area. But, to me, Dave Rose is one of my closest friends in the business. I love Dave and Cheryl, great people. And, I'll never forget when I was with them, he invited me out to share with him when we were waiting to see if he'd get the good news on his first scan when he was going through cancer. I only have good memories of the people. Tom Olmo, the athletic director, is awesome. And my experiences there have always been wonderful. I'll give you a little crazy nugget that I remember that this is stuck in my, I remember there was an era, and I don't know if they still do this. I don't think so. I think we would have heard about this. There was a time in the 90s when the visiting teams would get toiletry kits, in the locker room,
right?
Which doesn't happen anywhere else. And I always remember other players would be like, almost like when you go first class, international, and you get the little, Delta little toiletry kit.
Yeah.
And then they would be in the locker room, and everything was done at such a, at such a first class level.
So Cougar Hoops, you mentioned Roger. It goes from Roger to Steve Cleveland to Dave Rose to now Mark Pope. Your thoughts on what BYU's been able to do in the way of college hoops continuity over 20 plus years, let's say?
So, it's interesting because, I think also it's a great testament. Look, there's no secret, that you would ideally have a coach who is, practicing the faith, and obviously makes sense with an LDS school. But I always remember, like, when openings came up, oh, the pool's so small, who are you going to get? And I think what we've seen, first of all, is the pool isn't so small. That the pool is larger than we think. The recruiting base is larger than we think. And although in recruiting, it doesn't have to be that way, and hasn't, and that's fine. But in the coaching ranks, there's wonderful people out there. There's great, candidates, and they've made the right calls. I love the way Dave has, and Cheryl, and I sat with them at the WCC. The way that has been handled, I think, is a model for all schools. And I'll give you an example that I think is the worst. Okay, so like St. Joseph's, Phil Martelli poured his life and soul into that school, took them to an Elite Eight, really was the face of St. Joe's. New AD comes in, things obviously had gone down with them, and they just blow them out, write this like one-page press release after 24 years, and now there's like no relationship. Okay, zero. And that hurts, former players and all that. And it's just such the wrong way to do it. Clearly, not just with his health issues, and they'd reached a little bit of a plateau. They had a great run and had, consistent success, obviously wanted more in the WCC. But Dave also knew maybe the timing was not there anymore. I mean, maybe they need a new voice. And he recognized it. The way he exited was, I thought, graceful, respectful, and they've treated him well. And now he's right there with the program and embraced. And Mark has done a phenomenal job of making sure that connection is there. They still live there. All their children and grandchildren are in the area. And so I think that, the way that the administration has handled, the way the current staff is allowed for a seamless transition. And Mark is, he's great personality. And I think that, the addition of someone like Matt Harms is another example of how BYU is attractive regardless of your faith or anything like that, because it's a great place to be, and the way you play, the support. I mean, just what has happened the last couple of years, and especially this past season, and you see the atmosphere. How could you not want to be in that environment? I mean, and say that it's not one of the better environments to play in and be a part of.
Is there a better atmosphere in college basketball than you all?
And so I think there's a lot of positive aspects to this. It's just such a shame of what happened this season, because I'm a firm believer in the what-if game. And I really thought that BYU, my two sleeper teams were BYU and Creighton. I really believe that they were going to go on a run and possibly be Final Four teams in the right bracket because of the way they played, the way they scored. Yoli was like on fresh legs because he'd missed so much time with the suspension and the injuries. We'll never know, but I think that would have even helped the brand even more going forward.
And that's a perfect segue, Andy, into what I wanted to ask you next, because while some may have been somewhat surprised at the level of success that BYU basketball had last year, you were not one of them. I remember before the season even started, you were saying you thought this was an NCAA tournament team. What made you believe before the season even started that the success that we saw was possible?
Well, I mean, I talked to Dave and Mark, and also other coaches in the league, but I'm also a firm believer in today's modern college basketball, which is if you're old and stay old, you got a great shot, and if you can score. And BYU could do all of that and had all of that. Now, I didn't know that Yoli Childs was going to be suspended for the first 9 games, but even the way they managed that, I wouldn't say they got lucky, but getting that win at Houston really changed, I think, the narrative for their season. The thing that had been sort of the bugaboo for Dave in the first few seasons in the WCC is, they actually had good success at Gonzaga, snapped their long winning streak there. But then, they would lose some of those games that you'd be like, to the teams at the bottom that you just can't do. I think one year at USD, those are the things that I think it prevented them from making that next, step or being off the bubble, or, if they got in, staying out of Dayton. So, there were all the indicators, I thought, that for them to have the kind of season that they did.
Andy, from ESPN to the NCAA, how do you view the last, say, 20 years of your career, how it's turned out?
Well, I've been very fortunate, resourceful, and my advice to everyone out there is you have to change. And I think a lot of people in our profession, certainly in newspapers, were against it. I mean, I embraced the digital age, and I've been doing sort of one-man band stuff for years now. I'll go back to one of the things I think was a turning point at ESPN for me when we really started doing much more digital interviews. I was doing sideline for a game between Cincinnati and UConn, and Mick Cronin had gotten tossed by Teddy Valentine. And so he's out and game's over. They're on to the next game. But I'm like, hey, we got to hear from Mick Cronin. He got, mouth to mouth with Valentine. And so I literally just used my phone by the locker room to get a post game with him, and he went off and all that. And we ended up renting that on SportsCenter. And at the time, the digital editor at ESPN, he caught a photo, or he snapped a photo off of the screenshot, because you can see, while in the background as I'm interviewing Mick on my cell phone, you can see behind me the game camera guy walking back to the truck, because we were back by the locker room area where the truck was, carrying $60,000 camera. And so, to him, that was a great way to show, look, the traditional game crew, they're done. There's still content to gather, and we're going to get it how we're going to get it. And, it was a little crude at the time. Audio wasn't great, but we got it. And it's improved so much. My timing, everyone loves to say everything works out for a reason. I didn't wish this to happen to me, in the layoffs that happened in 2017. I know I did nothing wrong or anything like that, but, everything has worked out wonderfully well. Putting all sort of my jigsaw puzzle together with the NCAA.com, March Madness, them just raising their digital platform and being able to cover the whole country like this, Fox Sports and Big Ten Network, working with the WCC and the Pac-12, allowing me to do all these different things. I do a couple little side things with some other leagues, but I'm doing as well, if not better than before, more flexibility, seeing more of the country, at a time when ESPN has rolled back its digital platforms. They're just not doing what I'm doing now for March Madness, and the other entities that we were doing 5 years ago, they kind of stopped doing it. And now with Skype and now Zoom, that we've now all fallen into during the pandemic, just through various ways that I'm recording podcasts. I'm talking to you now in this home studio that Turner March Madness built for me. It's coincidentally, they put this in my home in January, sort of a just in case. And now I'm using it like nonstop over the last 5 weeks. And as you guys know, in this business, lights and angles are everything, and the lighting's great here. So that's helped tremendously in pulling all this off during this time.
Andy, the NCAA has had a couple of news items recently. One, it appears that players are moving towards the ability to be able to be compensated for their name and likeness. And then also, the one-year waiver does not look like it's going to be passed through. Just your overall thoughts on those two things and how they impact NCAA, athletics.
The NIL issue, everything was trending that way. Their hand was forced, obviously, as legislation in various states around the country. So we knew that was going to happen. We'll see how it all actually ultimately shakes out. There will be guardrails. Navigating the booster aspect, can't be recruiting and inducement, but once you're there, will be allowed. No cap on what you could earn. You can't contradict your sponsorship with your school. So, if you were a Nike school, you suddenly could not do an Adidas ad, although you probably wouldn't be, the way it works now at the Nike school if you were a straight Adidas person. But, the thing to me, and my kids would tell me this too, that where I think the new frontier, if you will, where the money can be made is in social media. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. I think these athletes will make more money that way than a traditional car dealer ad or something like that. Because what we're going to see is, take, Gonzaga and BYU, okay, Spokane and Provo, where there could be, plenty of opportunities for potential deals. But in the Bay Area, in LA, college sports just doesn't register. I mean, if you were to go down, name someone in UCLA, USC, or Cal, Stanford, or St. Mary's, or what have you, very difficult. Pro athletes have a hard time finding that space. So maybe those athletes, could benefit through the social media where it doesn't matter where you are, and you're not maybe making as much locally. So it had to happen. How it's managed will be a whole nother issue. Hopefully it doesn't corrupt the sport. Hopefully it helps it more, but we were heading in this direction. As for the transfer, I do think it ultimately will happen for the fall of 21-22, the one-time waiver, because the NCAA needs to get out of the business of judging and being the, judge and jury of whether or not your grandmother or your aunt is sick, to get a waiver. But I just didn't think that was going to happen right away amid this pandemic. Universities are cutting costs, trying to just get on, in any way they can. So, I just didn't see that would happen at this juncture. But I think it will happen. Good news for BYU with Matt Harms, he's a grad transfer. That's unaffected, just so everyone knows, that's unaffected with this. You've graduated, you can transfer right away and play. This is all about transfers that just want to transfer from one four-year institution to the other and try to play right away at least one time without having to sit out.
Andy, last thing for you, personal note. We know you're working from home. Are you running from home? We know you're a runner, half marathons, big part of your life in the last decade or so. How's that coming?
Going well. I've already, though, unfortunately had 2 races canceled.
Yeah.
That I was supposed to do. It's funny. Like when I lived out west, I was not a runner in that part of my life, but now I have been. And yes, we've just had kind of a dreary spring so far, but hopefully things will pick up in that regard. But I don't know. I need to be better about running in altitude out there. That's for sure. By the way, one of the best walk hikes that I remember doing also, I think that might've been that time when I was out there with Dave and Cheryl, was that Provo Canyon. Yeah. Obviously in spring, late spring, would love to be out there and, going down there as well.
It is beautiful. Well, no games are being played anywhere by anyone, but yet you are among the busiest guys in the business, and no one does it better. Andy, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule, being with us today on VoiceOver.
All right. Thanks, guys. Be safe out there, and hopefully we'll be watching BYUtv in the fall with sports actually happening.
You can find every episode of VoiceOver with Greg and Shep on the BYUtv Sports YouTube page. Plus, you can listen to the audio version by subscribing to Behind the Mic with Greg Wrubell or by going to the show page on BYUradio.org. Don't forget, for even more Cougar sports content live or on demand, make sure to download the BYUtv and BYU Radio apps. Thanks once again to our guest, Andy Katz. We'll talk to you next time. Go Cougs.